can start. Good morning, everyone. Hi, my name's Ed Parsons from Google. This is my colleague here, Clemens, from Interactive Instruments. This is actually a workshop, which means that although Clemens and I will be doing some talking, we actually do want some interaction, and specifically, we're going to ask you some questions. So bearing that in mind, it'd be great if you move forward. I know everyone hates doing this because you just want to sit in the back of the room and do your email, but this is a workshop, so you need to move slightly more to the front. That would be great. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk for maybe 10 minutes or so, just putting the work of the W3C OGC working group into spatial data on the web into some context. And in particular, then, we've got a number of questions or areas that we're working on that we'd really appreciate your feedback on. And we'll dig into those in a little bit more detail in a moment. So first off, what's the problem? Why are we all here? Well, I think the problem can be summarized pretty much down to this, that most of the data that we currently publish, even using the very sophisticated SDIs and approaches, of which Inspire is one around the world, the data is still largely implicit and unstructured, even including some of the stuff that's done in SDIs. But across the whole of the web, when we publish data, it's not particularly structured and it's not particularly explicit. Most web content about places is unstructured because it appears just on HTML pages that have been published somewhere. If we want to obtain knowledge and information from those web pages, then we need to apply a lot of work, a lot of effort, natural language processing, inference, and so on. And fundamentally, it doesn't scale. So we're spending a lot of time as publishers of content publishing that information, but we're not getting the full benefit from the information, from its content. So how might we solve that particularly? Well, for the geospatial industry, the problem is almost always even worse, because what we have done is we've built up our own methodology, our own web services to publish location information. And that works very well potentially for our community. So if we're only publishing content for our community, that kind of works, because we understand what OGC web services are, we understand catalog servers, and we understand, ISO 19107. We live and breathe this stuff, but the rest of the world doesn't. And actually, when we are publishing data, it's largely the data is coming from large government publishers, enterprise customers. So we've developed a methodology that's probably fit for purpose, arguably, for the GIS industry or for the GI industry, but not for the broader web, because we're doing things in our own particular way. Okay, so if that doesn't work, how are we going to fix it? Well, the approach comes at the same time when there's this broader effort in terms of publishing open data, open government data, using an approach called linked data. And this is something that you can buy a mug from. We all aspire to own one of these mugs. That shows you the fact that actually there's a range of things that you can do to publish data, publish open data in particularly, adding value as you go along. You can start off by just making sure that the data you publish is on the web. That gets you 1 star. So most of us are at that point. You can make sure the data is machine readable, i.e. it's not in some proprietary binary format that no one can understand. Non-proprietary formats give you more points. Then, if you go to RDF, which is a description language for semantic content, you get a bit more. And then if you link your content to other content that it's related to, then you get 5 stars. So there's this kind of, I suppose, direction of travel that says if we're really going to make the most use of open government data, it's not just good enough publishing it on a website. We need to make sure that data is semantically rich and it's linkable. So a couple of years ago in London, both the W3C and OGC, the standards bodies in our area, got together and had a workshop to look at these areas of publishing geospatial data using approaches that are related to this emerging field of the linked data, linked web. And as a result of that, the two organizations got together and created a working party, working group that has been going now for about 18 months. And if you want to understand what's going on, that's the website by which pretty much everything that we do is documented. So it's done on a W3C wiki, and all the information about meetings, deliverables, everything is at that site. So that's the one URL to come back to and visit. Okay, so what are we actually going to try and do then as this working group? So the mission was to determine how spatial data can be best integrated with other data on the web, to determine how we can make that data machine readable so we can get some automatic processing and inference from the information. And the way we're going to deliver this is, rather than creating new standards, to identify the best practice that already exists. Now, there are some new technology, new methodologies that will be developed, but largely what we're aiming to do is to just point at what is best practice, what's happening elsewhere that works well. You know, the last thing we want to do is to create not yet another standard. We have enough standards. We don't need any more. So to complete standardization, I mean, formal technology already in widespread use. So we've got a few things we just need to finish off, but there's nothing new fundamentally that needs to be created. And this is important. Where relevant, we'll promote linked data using the 5 stars linked data paradigm, but not at the exclusion of other technologies. If you've been involved in the semantic web, in linked data, there's almost a religious zeal that this is the approach that you have to take to deliver the maximum benefit from your users. We're not going to argue that you can get great results theoretically from this approach, but what we're saying is we'll use that as an end, as a goal, but actually if there are benefits that we can get sooner by doing simple things that aren't reliant on, for example, RDF, then we should do so. So try to maximize the benefit we can get simply by using other techniques that get you towards that linked data paradigm, but not necessarily have to use RDF. So the deliverables that the working group have been working on over the past 18 months are these, a quite comprehensive set of use cases and requirements, the spatial data on the web best practices document. That's taking up quite a lot of our time and effort at the moment, and that's probably going to be the document that most of you make use of when it's published. And that's largely what we're going to concentrate on today, is getting your feedback to that best practice document. A time ontology in OWL, semantic sensor network vocabulary, so another ontology, and how do we handle coverages, i.e. data sets that are kind of varying over time and space in a linked data approach. So there's a lot there. There's a lot there to do in 2 years, which is the amount of time that you have as a W3C organization. That's the charter length. But we're going to focus today, this morning, on the spatial data on the web best practice. So identifying what are the techniques, methodologies, what standards are out there to make our data more linkable, more visible on the web than currently is done. So what is best practice? This is the best practice document as it existed at the end of last week, I suppose. The URL for it is there. It's held in GitHub. So there's a GitHub repo containing the document. It is, I suppose, I think it probably is editable if you have a GitHub user account, but I would strongly advise you not doing that. It's very easy to mess it up. What I would suggest you do, if you have any comments, email us and we'll integrate those comments. The editors will integrate those comments into the document. But what we're going to go do this morning is go through some of this document. I'm going to ask you for some questions. I'm going to ask you some comments. Clemens is going to document those and give that feedback back to the editors. And that feedback then will find its way into the document as the document is written. So let's look at some of the aspects of this document. And this is where I'd like your feedback in particular. Now, to put the document into context, the audience of which we're aiming this document at is not explicitly you in the audience here, actually. We recognize the fact that, yes, people that are responsible for SDIs, people that have been involved with Inspire over the years are a crucial audience. But actually, the broader audience for this are anyone that's developing services on the web for publishing spatial data, or anyone that's building services, applications, be it that on the web or mobile devices, that will consume spatial data. So this is potentially a much broader audience than we are traditionally aiming our efforts at. So the first set of questions, I guess the first comments I'd like from you in the audience, and we're going to try as hard as we can to make this interactive, is that the right audience? We're aiming very specifically at practitioners, not necessarily people that are building policy, not people that are necessarily managers of spatial database infrastructures, but the people that are on a day-to-day basis publishing data, and equally importantly, those people that are consuming that content in terms of building apps, new services, and so on. So, first point, is that right? Is there anyone else that we should be thinking about? Is the focus on practitioners something that we should be doing? We will take no feedback as yes, that's the right approach then. Yeah? Sound right? Okay. I didn't think there'd be much debate about that one. Okay. The next point then. This one might be a bit more of a controversial subject. We very much see the practitioner community as divided up into 99.99999% of people who are not involved in SDI and a very small percentage of people who are. So most of our focus is not you specifically. We're saying most of the people that will be making use of this best practice probably have no background in SDIs, may only have a very vague background in geospatial information. They're coming to this document because they know they've got some geographical content that they need to publish, but they don't know how. They don't have a background in GIS, geospatial technology, GPS, all those things. So, and this is a very important point, I really would like your feedback on this. Is it right for us to focus mostly on the yellow flowers, that 99.9% of people who are not SDI experts, than the SDI experts? It's not saying there's going to be nothing there for SDI people, because clearly you are publishers of spatial data. But much of what we're aimed at are the people that probably are barely aware that they have spatial data. What do you think? Please.
do not want to have people with a background background with spatial knowledge, so that you know specifically what is special or not special about spatial, and not diving into the SDI stuff, but well, in location stuff.
Okay, any other points, any other comments?
From the user perspective, I understand it's not 99%, but on the other side, there has to be data suppliers, and there should be data around in-link data formats. And currently, there's not that much spatial data around in-link data and other kinds of formats. So I think for the supplier side, you also have to look at the SDI people to get more link data in the spatial world. Yeah. Otherwise, there's nothing to use.
That's true. Absolutely. Good, okay. You okay with those comments? Excellent. All right. So the next contextual piece then, I guess, or next piece is then focusing on some more specific questions. Now, these are looking at some focus areas that one of the editors or some of the editors of the document specifically wanted us to get some feedback from. And they are in some ways quite detailed, and you can need to sort of perhaps dig into the document to fully understand the context. But I'm going to try to ask a number of these questions at the moment. We'll go through them, get your feedback. But as I say, it's probably a good idea to go and look at the document as well. So the first specific question is about the fourth of our best practice documents. And we have a number of best practice ideas currently formulated in the document. But the first of these is on a thorny issue about, I suppose, about terminology. And it's, again, perhaps recognizing the point that from an SDI perspective, we have our series of terminology that we use and we've become quite familiar with. But in the linked data world, there's perhaps slightly different terminology used and different aspects. And it's to do with this idea of what is a thing? What are we actually interested in when we are building a spatial data set, and what should we call that thing? And the example we're often using is this. This is actually Eddystone Lighthouse. Now, for all of us, at one level, we could recognize that, well, Eddystone Lighthouse is a thing. You can walk into it, you can say it's at a particular location, you can take photographs of it. How do we actually model that in a database? How do we model that as linked data? Now, traditionally, in a GIS spatial data infrastructure worldview, perhaps, we would say that, well, it's of a feature class. We'd say it was a feature class lighthouse. And that will be the core element that we'd be talking about. In our mindset at the moment, in terms of linked data, actually, we see things perhaps slightly differently. We see a more abstract idea of a spatial thing, of something that we might want to talk about that actually isn't necessarily a feature with a fixed set of attributes. There may be features associated with a lighthouse that have, for example, fixed properties like geometry and a coordinate reference system associated with that geography. But there may be a case where there's a thing, something that we're interested in that has no geometry associated with it. How do we handle that? So our mindset at the moment is to treat spatial things as our core interest and recognize the fact that there may be features associated with those that have geometry. There may be other times where we have no geometry associated with that spatial thing. Am I describing that well?
I think one of the key concerns with the term feature is that from most people who are not from our domain, it's a different concept, right? So they think about a feature as a capability of a software or something like that. So when you say this is the lighthouse is a feature, they're shaking. They don't understand that. So I think it's not so different really, because also a feature can have no geometry or multiple, or I think it's more a terminology thing. If we put in feature there, it will not be understood. It's understood by our community, well, maybe, But that's more the idea, and I think it's also more the feature. The other key thing that we're debating is the feature. It's quite clear from the definition, it's an abstraction of the thing in the real world. And with spatial things, we're slightly more vaguer whether we're talking about the digital thing or the thing in the real world. So that's how I would phrase it.
Yeah, so you see why we're having this as a pointed discussion, can't you? So let's look at that very key point of a feature for most people is a capability of a piece of software. I guess what we're asking was, is it acceptable to the community that you represent for us not to use feature in that sense, in the sense that we traditionally use it in the data modeling sense, but rather talk about spatial things? Or you think, well, this is all just abstract nonsense, I'm not interested.
Well, I think it's a good thing. Yes, the implementation of statistics, people don't talk about features, they talk about phenomena, statistical phenomena. That's the same as features. Their way of expressing their interests from a statistical point of view. Everybody keeps it looking because, in the end, the main objective of putting everything together is geometry. That's a way to link data to the world. As a way to have data in a comprehensive way. That's the big message in there. So you have to have a common ontology, which is not domain specific. So, well, feature is very specific.
That's right. I mean, I think that's a good point. As far as that idea of feature, it sits you in a particular domain. And what we want to try to do is kind of break that and say, actually, often because we're talking about the same thing, but it's recognized there's different features in different domains. And it's the same thing. Yes.
Isn't it reinventing the wheel again? Coming from linguistics and semiotic triangle, we're speaking of real-world objects, spatial things. We're speaking of the description of it, like the features. And then we have a thought in mind that is completely different from the real-world object and the feature, which is defined by the community. So we have to deal with this.
I also think there's a slight risk here in the sense that there's a huge tradition as to why we've arrived as maybe thousands of people across Europe to use these words. And I'm not saying that we know everything at all, but there's going to have to be some education on both sides. So the fact that the word feature could have several meanings in English if you take it completely separate from its context is something to pay attention to. I quite like spatial things because it grabs people's attention. What the hell do you mean? And then, of course, that's the basis of any kind of discourse. So I just want to pick up on the lighthouse one because it may trigger some other conversation. I remember being taught that a lighthouse, that's clearly got something to do with safety. You know, it's there to protect ships at sea. But if you're an aircraft, it's a hazard. So just trying to conceptualize what these things are and their context could be very important. And I think the point for me is there has to be some really substantial semantics research behind how any kind of information is conveyed across communities, interdisciplinary, and of course multilingual.
I think that's a good point. The idea of discipline is saying feature very differently. It's something that we're trying to capture with that spatial thing.
Good morning. Why don't you just use object?
Yeah, Hugo thinks object. Object, not bad.
I think whatever you do, you need to define it.
Okay, have we kind of captured the feeling of the room there, do you think?
I try my best.
You try your best, yeah.
You can read it, it will all be published.
This will all be published, yeah, absolutely. I'll hang on to this and I'll run around with it. We're going to get any feedback. Section 9 of the document. Actually, I might bring the document up. That might be a good thing to do. Let me just do this up. Is about, I suppose, How do you express best practice? Let me pull this across the side while I'm getting it sorted out. One moment. So as a best practice document, what's the best way of actually, I suppose, kind of formalizing the content in a way that is useful to people who are practitioners? Okay, one moment, let me get this up. All right, let's get to section 9. Okay, best practice. Sorry about this. Right. Okay. There we go. Right. This was the list I got up earlier. Here we go. So one of those aspects then is, I suppose this is an unusual area. I was kind of thinking about how different is this to a traditional GIS approach to publishing information. So best practice 7 is specifically saying one of the best practices that we suggest that people follow is to use, as it says there, unique HTTP identifiers for spatial things. So if you're publishing content about lighthouses, you would have within your database for each lighthouse record a way of identifying that particular record as you publish it. So it's looking at about a very granular level of publishing, and publishing using a technique that would allow somebody else to link specifically to that particular record, to that particular spatial thing. So it's saying you should use a globally unique HTTP identifier for each spatial thing, so that spatial things referred to in a data set have a persistent HTTP identifier. So, for example, here is an example from the Dutch cadastre about a particular land parcel. So that record may contain information about ownership, about the size of that particular land parcel, when it was surveyed, so on and so forth. But it's identifiable using that particular identifier. And the best practice says we should do that, and while we're doing that, reuse identifiers when we can. So if we're talking about a spatial thing that someone else has already identified, use their URI. When there are no reusable identifiers, create your own, but do that in a logical way. And then finally, provide stable identifiers for spatial things that change over time. So the lighthouse, Eddystone Lighthouse, has been rebuilt 3 or 4 times. It's still Eddystone Lighthouse, although its geometry has changed, other characteristics about it have changed. We need it, therefore, to have a stable URI for that spatial thing. Does that make sense? Does that sound like it's a good idea? See, I'm not so keen.
Of course, I'm not an expert and it's too early in the morning, but there's a TV series called Only Fools and Horses from the 1980s, and there was a character called Trigger who used to clean the roads, and he got a prize for the same broom. So I'll have to explain a little bit more. So he got a prize for keeping the same broom to clean the street several years, but it changed the handle 4 times and the head 3 times. But it's the same broom. So the point is it the same lighthouse? What's the use of the data? Who cares about it? For me, it's a lot about context to do with anything you're doing, but providing some sense to that. And I think it's a great difficulty we have with data, because you're not going to spend your whole time, unless it's going to be somehow automatically generated, to give some sense of the context. And in a more practical case, if I think about the way that buildings change with the TOIDS and Ordnance Survey data, that can be really interesting data to process. You can use that for urban development and lots of other things. So I think what's fundamental here is the notion of change. And I don't know if you guys are capturing the essence of that in some way, or if it's better actually other people start to model that.
Yeah, so I'm going to have to obviously explain in greater detail Only Fools and Horses in that particular episode later on. But actually, it's a very good example. Is the thing the lighthouse or the broom that is constant, but actually then are there different things that are each instantation, or each version of that over time? It's a point of discussion. But think about that, I think maybe from a GI point of view. What we're talking about here is potentially not just linking to a database, but linking to each individual record within that database. That's perhaps one of the key changes of saying, if I have a database of 400 lighthouses, it's not good enough just to provide a link to the database or to provide a metadata catalog record about the database. I should be publishing at that individual record level. Each database has its own unique identifier. Or each record, should say, has its own unique identifier. Any other thoughts or comments?
Certainly with my data, there are times where we have to take an individual unit, and because of some work that we've done to the road, in my case, we split that unit into a smaller unit. And it's the identifier for the bits that are split are different from the original identifier. Now, I see that as actually quite useful, because you can actually see how the road has developed. And I think my worry about what you're suggesting here is, if we've had 3 Edison lighthouses, it's actually really useful to know we're talking about the 3rd Edison lighthouse, not the 1st Edison lighthouse. So I think it's useful to be able to know about the change. Now, I'm not sure if you can do that with versioning, but certainly from my point of view, my data, I would want to have the change.
Actually, in my view, this is one of the best practices where there is no conceptual difficulty really with Inspire, because Inspire is actually doing that. I mean, whether it's URIs or not, that's not that required, but the concept of identifiers assigned to individual features, that's deeply inside. And I think and it's also clear that it's stated, it's important to understand, I mean, there's no clear rule when is a thing a new thing and requires a new identifier. And those organizations that do that, like Ordnance Survey or the German mapping agencies, they have rules when that happens. So when does a building get a new identifier? Or when is it a change where it has the same identifier? I think those organizations that already maintain data sets with persistent identifiers will have these rules. That's what Inspire also says. And I think the challenge that I mostly see, so there are data sets which don't have these identifiers, which are managed, and then you create a new version and there is no identifier. So that's a challenge for this community, but that is basically aligned with that. And the second thing is then whether there is an HTTP URI. That's another infrastructure thing. The one thing is to have this identifier, and the other one is to actually have an HTTP URI that when you enter it, you get something back, right? So, but that topic, that best practice, I think, has been discussed for quite a long time, and this week also, I think there have been quite a few presentations about that topic.
But I guess by it being a HTTP identifier as opposed to just a unique identifier in your database, you can link to it.
But that's already a recommendation in Inspire, to use an HTTP URI.
it always seems we got a very low ambition level when we talk about URIs. I think it's quite clear to everybody, if you provide an identifier for an object, that the identifier should follow the life cycle of that object. That if the life cycle ends, it's archived. It still exists, but it's not relevant anymore. It's archived. You got a new object with a new identifier, which has a link to that old object. Could be a spatial link in a way it has the same location that it used to have, if that's relevant, but you follow the life cycle. And in every best practice, we never mention it. We just say, you need to use HTTP identifiers. Why don't we just say all your objects have to be resolvable? It doesn't make a difference which protocol you're using. Could be FTP, could be HTTP. HTTP is nice because it fits nice with the web, of course, to resolve your identifiers. But it has to be resolvable. So resolvable identifiers that follow the life cycles of the objects you are managing. That would be a nice definition to start.
So let's focus on the HTTP piece, resolvable in some way. I think for us the HTTP piece is quite important because it's part of the web infrastructure.
Maybe allow me to come back to the conceptual level. Isn't the identifier some kind of stability for the thing? But what is the stable thing of a thing? So if we are moving from the lighthouse to a chapel, and we are moving the chapel from one place to other, but it's the same building, it still has the same identifier? You just moved it. So the architecture is the stable thing? Where you put the identifier on?
That's your decision.
Hey, Clemens, you want to...
I think that's your decision. If you, for example, I think if in Germany, if you change the building from a lighthouse to a chapel, it would be a new identifier. It would get a new identifier. That's right. So it's your decision, as there is no general rule, and that best practice also doesn't try to impose that.
Okay, let's keep the kite and the lighthouse. You're moving the lighthouse just to another place. It's the same house, it's the same light, but on another place. It has a new identifier.
I don't know if that's regulated, but that's up to you as a data provider to actually do that.
Oh no, let's focus on the point here, which is about identifiers, not how you choose whether a thing has an identifier or not.
If the location is the same thing, that the name is identified, okay. But yesterday we spoke about link data, about identifier for things that are also moving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. That's fine, no problem with that.
Well, Ed, you got to solve this because he's talking about object, Marcus is talking about things. I can't follow.
Just make sure your thing has an identifier that's... just as a show of hands here, how many people here have spatial content they're currently publishing or responsible for? Okay, how many of you are using HTTP identifiers at the moment? Okay, so it's probably maybe half the people that we're publishing. Okay. It's a good example. I thought you would like that example, yeah. Okay, any other points or questions around that?
No, just to add to the last discussion, I think the discussion is not about moving around buildings or changing the identifiers, but what is this thing? So if it's the function of the lighthouse, it won't change, so the same identifier. If you're going to move around or change the function, then it will be another identifier.
Oh, I quite like that. Did you get that one down? That was quite good.
Pardon? That was about changing the function?
That was about if
Is it
each
you
has if a
identify
different
change-
function, it's a
What?
different function, it's a different thing, so it has a different identifier, I guess.
But I would still say that's up to the data provider, how he has the definition of it's
Yeah.
building definition thing.
So remember, the key thing about this best practice is that use of identifiers that are HTTP, i.e. they're things that we can link to on the web. They provide a mechanism for jumping from one thing to another thing at that level. I often try to explain this to people is if I can, if you want to tell me about whatever spatial thing you're interested in, can you just provide me a link to it in an email? That's the kind of level that we want to be able to get to. I can send you an email about this thing, and you'll be able to drill down specifically to that particular record. Okay, so that's best practice number 7 about globally unique HTTP identifiers. Next one then, best practice number 4. Make your data indexable by search engines. This is part, I suppose, of a recognition that actually much of the spatial data that we currently publish on the web is invisible to search engines. It's not indexable. There's no way for a web crawler to drill into a particular coverage service or work its way through a web feature server and look at the individual records. So there needs to be some way, there needs to be some methodology, some idea of us exposing content in a way that it's crawlable by web search technologies and therefore is searchable on the web in the same way that any other information is searchable on the web. So a couple of points here, a couple of, I suppose, propositions you may agree or disagree with. Metadata is not really on the web until it's crawlable. One approach you might want to take, and this is the approach used here in this example of the city of Nanaimo, which is in Canada, is you generate one HTML page per resource. So at that level that you're publishing, remember you said that everything in your data set has a HTTP URI. Well, what you might do is have a HTML page around each particular resource. So for each lighthouse, for whatever you're publishing. And provide a path using site links or your robots.txt document so that search engines can find all of your pages. Search engines won't necessarily dig very deeply if there aren't links on each individual page for them to follow. So you need to think about how you structure your HTML pages, that they follow a linking structure that a web crawler can follow. Now, Clemens has had some experience, I think, in doing this in practice.
We had a workshop yesterday on that.
Oh, very good. So he can tell you more about that. But what do we think about this? Is it practical to take this approach? Not sure. Do you recognize the problem, though? That actually most users, that 99% of the world, are going to go to Bing or Google or Yahoo, still just about probably, to search for things, and they're not going to find the content that we're publishing, because what we're publishing is invisible to the rest of the web. Okay, so the point is you need to be able to do more than just create a HTML page for it. Not necessarily to be crawlable, but then to come up in the search results. What about the practicality of this? Could you imagine if you've got the Ordnance Survey and you have however 100 million polygons of master map data, are you going to create a HTML page for every one?
Which I doubt for now. What it does, I think that's a valid question, and if I could just jump in with this other thing that occurred to me. When I was at university as a student, I would go and try and find the textbook in the library. And of course some other people had already got there and taken it out. But what was always really nice were the books beside where my book should have been. And I think what I'm trying to say is there's still quite a lot of validity in geoportals for that reason. Because it's this context, this kind of filtering. And I think there needs to be this mix of finding, even down to the spatial object level, things and being able to associate with them and provide that kind of infrastructure. But again, you might want to know where things are coming from and what else is like it. And what I think needs to happen there is maybe a bit more work on analytics around the geoportals that add value to the content, not just provide a catalogue, but tell you something more about it, which could also relate to what you're asking. And
just to be clear here, we're not as a working group suggesting that we shouldn't build portals. That's not a widely held opinion. It's an opinion held by some of us, but not widely held. So we're saying that, you take these best practices probably in addition to what you're currently doing as well. And I think you're right. There is something about that serendipity of finding information that is spatially related to the stuff that you're looking for because it's close by. It's the first law of geography is things close to each other are probably similar and interesting in that related sense. So we don't want to lose that, but we do have to solve this problem that much of what we're currently publishing just is invisible to most web users, and this is an approach. Any other thoughts?
I think it's a very good approach to actually make people aware about the objects you're serving, but it goes very deeply against the principle of how we've been using metadata for many, many years. We're good in building feature catalogs, describing the initial objects, but when it comes to the instantiation of the objects, we're only describing the coverages, the data sets, which are the collections of a set of objects for a certain coverage, mainly a region, a province, a country. We've never been describing the singular objects. So it only goes, I don't think our existing standards, meaning most of the ISO standards, support for describing individual features in catalogs. So we stay at the level of definition rather than instantiation. So, and that's a big change. It doesn't know I don't think it's not, it means it cannot be done. I think it should be quite easy, but because generating web pages based on the metadata you already have with the specific identifier for the spatial object that you have would be on the fly. This would be automatically generated pages, but millions of them. For every grid cell, for example, of a raster would actually provide a metadata page, which is, well, might be ridiculous in the end.
So we are looking at sort of coverage data, and raster data is a slightly different approach, but that is a key point. Any other comments around this point? Clemens, do you want to add anything from your experience or from your workshop yesterday?
Well, yeah, I think I recognize several faces who were here also yesterday, but in general, I think one of the key things is that I think it's possible, it's what we clearly learned is it's possible to do that, but it's also unclear how, let's say, the index, one of the key issues that we still have is that if we publish 9 million addresses from the Netherlands and we still get, after half a year, 0.2% indexed, we could say it's indexable, but it's not really indexed. So we're only halfway there, and it's kind of, for us, the search engines, Google, but also Bing, etc., they are kind of a black box. So it requires more work. I think the important part is that's definitely the way to go, in my view. We need to make sure that we can make the things findable, because that's what most people, in particular those who are not familiar with geoportals, they will always use Google to search things. I do that myself, actually. But I think there's more understanding also on your side needed, and we need to work together on how to actually make that useful, because many of the concepts that the search engines use don't really work that well. So sitemaps, which is a typical thing how you can organize larger collections, the sitemap is limited to 25,000 links. So how many sitemaps do I need then for a 10 million feature data set? And so I think also the whole architecture that we currently have isn't yet clear how to deal with these kind of data sets, right? So it's not just this community that needs to work, but it's also the web community that tries to organize the content that needs to do, and I think it's an opportunity to actually work together. That's I think to really create value, so that so it's not just the spatial community that needs to make sure that the things are findable, but it's also guys like you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No question about that. We also we need to provide some sort of a mechanism, as you say, that says it's a valid thing to go and index these 5 million, records that might be associated. Then actually identifying the fact that each of these are equal. Because at the moment, a lot of indexing is done in a relatively simple, straightforward way, but then actually ranking the results when you search that index, we'll obviously have to take a different approach, because database of addresses, surely every address is equal. It should have an equal chance of coming up, regardless of how interesting the page about that address is. And that's not currently how it works.
The other thing that I also mentioned yesterday is what Dan Brickley shared. So there is this activity with schema.org and Google to actually understand better how data sets are being published and how could they be, the metadata on the HTML page should look like, so that there is value in how it's indexed. So I think there's ongoing work.
Okay, so that was that best practice number 4. Okay, next one we want to ask you some feedback on are providing geometries on the web in a usable way. So this, I suppose, is quite a fundamental issue, and one that perhaps we're more familiar with. How do you encode geometry? How do you describe geometry on the web? What methodology do you use? So some of the propositions we make here are support the relevant dimensionality of the geometry. If it's just 2D geometry, well, that's okay. But if it's 3D geometry, you need to think more carefully, perhaps. Have an encoding that's supported by software tools within that particular user community. Keep geometry descriptions to a size that is convenient for your web applications. So perhaps not choose a geometry type that uses 50 megabyte to describe a single XY coordinate. And make sure the encoding you use supports the CRS, the coordinate reference system you may want to be using. I suppose, I'm not sure, I don't think there's perhaps anything particularly controversial about this, but I'm interested in your feedback. So this is saying, okay, if I just have, I want to describe the geometry of the Elliston Lighthouse, perhaps I just want to encode it as a pair of coordinates, what approach should I take? And for the geeks in the audience, yes, that is a piece of GeoJSON. What do we think? Alex? Oh, might well be.
Aren't we supposed to be thinking about what the user, the yellow flowers, are thinking about? Yeah. So support the CRS you need, not support the CRS they need? Question.
Yes, that's a very good question. It's a very good point. It's one that's had much discussion about, should there be a default coordinate reference system you use when you publish data? And if you do, what coordinate reference system should that be? But that's a different point to this one, and we're not asking you specifically about that, although perhaps there'd be maybe some time at the end for a discussion around that, because it's always quite interesting. Yeah. So this might mean publishing in perhaps a different encoding system than you currently use. Maybe. See, that's got some feedback.
Encoding is also always very confusing. Well, it's close to the technical evolution. It follows technical evolution quite rapidly, but I know you guys have been suggesting use of GeoJSON and probably enable some more intelligent linking by using JSON-LD. But I saw some JSON-LD and it's a big mess after a while, so you rather do not use LD. But I also saw some good developments and coding from the scientific community with coverage JSON, beautiful thing, time data, time scale data in there, very condensable, 50 megabyte files zip up to 500K, beautiful, delivered in 2 seconds, very efficient, very convenient. That's one thing, it's the encoding. So it's quite unclear which encoding to use, but in the end, it's a client thing. It's your browser, it's a client, it's a desktop, it's an application, it's an app, and it will use the messaging and the encoding. And I think the more encodings we have, the better, that people can choose the right one for them. And for delivering data very fast to very lightweight applications, I think JSON is the way to go. But on the CRS side, again, there also you have a lot of discussions. So in Inspire, we have ETRS 89, which is, we got 3 of them. So we got UTM and the LCC. So that's the thing we're supporting. And more people are asking for a web locator solution. Not only for the data, also for grids. So it might be worth discussing it again. Have a single CRS.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, maybe more specifically, you might say, well, you know, GML is not what we want. We want a piece of GeoJSON using WebMercator. That would be a change.
I would like to try to think like one of the yellow flowers. And then I would say, well, what's the problem? Because we didn't have that discussion on the language, on the alphabet, on text, which is always, in principle, the same. So what I think the basic points you said are quite valid, and I think all the solutions are already there in the GIS domain. So use them, applying those things. So I think that's the best solution.
Well, what I would like to add in terms of the encodings, so there is the spatial. I don't remember if you mentioned it, but there's the spatial data on the web best practice, but it builds on there is a candidate recommendation data on the web best practice, and that has one recommendation that says publish multiple formats or encodings or whatever media types. Try to do, I mean, it depends of course on the capabilities of the publisher, and but the recommendation is to support multiple of them. So then you can pick, well, that gives you, if it's all JSON, it also, there are more problems with that. If you have multiple JSONs, you need different media types for that. But then you can request GML and GeoJSON, JSON-LD, whatever. So I think that part is probably the easier part, except for when it gets to what's one of the other discussions that's there. If someone wants to use RDF, then what's the spatial ontology? Because there are so many of them, right? That's another discussion.
That's another discussion.
But in terms of CRS, I think the general feeling is, if you want to reach the 99%, then and the application doesn't require, let's say, the higher accuracy, then use WGS84, because that's what most people will understand on the web, or assume actually. If they see latitude, longitude, they don't think about ETRS 89, they think about WGS 84. I mean, it's 70 centimeters, but but at the same time, if you know that it's important for something, usually I think the general feeling now is publish it in the native format. So if you're in the Netherlands, publish it in the national CRS that is used, and in WGS 84. That's kind of the conclusion.
I think that's where we're heading, and that I suppose accounts for both the flowers. So if you are a red flower and it's important to you to have that link back to the original, then you'd publish using the coordinate system and the datum that is natural. But then for that wider web community, there is the assumption that you'll be using WGS84. And if you talk to most web developers now, any data format they like to use is some flavor of JSON, because the development environment of choice is the web browser, and the language of choice is JavaScript. So JSON is the flavor of the month. You can't deny that. Okay, any other comments around this particular topic? So it might be one of those areas where we end up recommending that this is I suppose, a change in behavior. Saying at minimum, perhaps you publish using 2 encodings. One that's for the broad 99% use, then maybe one that's more familiar. Okay. Good. Doing well. Next one. This is best practice 10. And this is the point that Clemens just hinted at. And this is perhaps the area of most debate, because it's perhaps the least established area. Use semantics, or use spatial semantics for spatial things. Choose the best vocabulary to describe your spatial things. So if you can, decide on an existing relevant vocabulary that can be used to describe the spatial things and their properties, i.e. Don't reinvent your own ontology if there's one out there. Provide linked data descriptions, define locations and spatial references using common vocabulary concepts, provide thematic semantics and general descriptions of spatial things and properties as linked data. So, it's key, it's an important point we make in that we're not going to suggest that you have to follow a fully semantic-rich RDF approach to publishing your data. But if you do, what we're saying is don't create your own ontology for your own data set, because actually that gives no one a benefit, really. We just end up with X ontologies plus one. So this is about trying to choose and fix upon a common ontology for your data set if we can. And that's difficult because, as Clemens pointed out, there are loads of them. And we are probably working with the OGC to develop at least a simple spatial ontology based on the work that was done on GeoSparkle a few years ago. But we recognize the fact there are many spatial ontologies out there, and this isn't necessarily going to be an easy problem to solve. I don't know, what do we think? Any points, comments around this? I think everyone conceptually says, yes, of course. Why would we create our own ontology if there was one out there? The trouble is, all the ones out there just don't quite meet the needs that you might have. What do we think?
It's a half-formulated response because I haven't got an answer, but I have a problem with the word best. The best vocabulary. How do you start to decide that? That would be interesting for me to know how we go about that, because maybe we could get some guidelines going or something like this. And I appreciate the problem there. But maybe there needs to be, not standardization, but there needs to be some examples and showing what you can use them for to help maybe explore that better. But the one word we haven't said yet really is interoperability, and that's unfortunately part of my business. And I'm just wondering then, in adopting all these things to try and make it easy for people to, let's say, reuse tools on top of these data structures or quickly publish the end user applications that I'm quite interested in hearing about. It kind of feels like we're going to struggle with this one for some time as people try and reach some sort of common agreement, or at least cover 80% of cases and leave the other 20% of cases that are maybe actually helping to support, I don't know, 90% of decisions, that kind of issue. And again, I think there's quite a strong research dimension to this. And I think that might be quite important, mainly because there'll be so many practitioners wondering which way to go.
Yeah. Thanks, Robin. So, yeah, I think we completely appreciate that this is an emerging area, and probably, I don't know, how many people here are currently using some sort of an ontology in the data they're currently publishing, obviously not for our Inspire, but a different approach?
I don't know how you look at the ISA core vocabulary, but there's an opportunity for extension, because the current description of geometry and location is very lame. And the links between the existing object in that vocabulary are lame as well. They have been funding ELF, ELF, EULF, so we got opportunities there in that general framework of ISA core, which provide capacity, some capabilities there to actually extend an existing concept. With the ideas we have, I know it's an EU initiative, it's not a global one, it's not a UN, but you got the people of Europe, what it's called, UNGGM Europe, we're also participating and developing core reference models for spatial objects, and that's adopted by UN. And that could be integrated in our ISA core vocabulary for the moment, and then we got a point to start and some guidance for people to implement, not only Inspire, but also their own applications for eGov. Bringing two worlds very close, or at least closer together than they are for the moment. So.
One comment on the core location vocabulary. I think it's part of, in its design, it tried to avoid that kind of thing because it by design, it leaves it open which spatial geometry ontology is actually used. So it provides a container so that you can see that this is geometry, but it doesn't say you have to use GeoSparkle or you have to use the W3C Geo or whatever ontology. So it's kind of, because it's so hard to make the decision what is the best vocabulary, right, for the specific use, or because some things are simple, some things are more complex and versatile, when sometimes CRSs are handled differently, and depending on the use case, you want to have several difference. But I think that's why it's debated also quite a bit, because that is one of the key things that we need to, as a community, need to clarify. How is geometry really published so that it's understandable and people aren't confused because Latlon is published in so many different ways, right? That's really a struggle, and I think it's if hopefully for me the idea would be if we can get somewhere here, then we can also amend, let's say, the core location vocabulary, at least with the recommendations on what to use.
No, I think I agree, but yes, I'm not sure if there is a best or not, but as long as you are clear in how you're going to record your coordinates or your location in principle, I think the real issue starts when you want to define also your topological relationships, and then it would be interesting because that's the spatial thing which makes it, in my opinion, useful to have those kind of things in place.
That's definitely something we're currently discussing. It's not one of the questions that Andrea asked us to ask, but actually is something we're looking at.
Yeah, so one of the thoughts there, there is the concept, when we talk about relationships, that's now a different standards organization, but IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, they have this standardization of link relations, so where you can describe relationships. And one of the thoughts is actually to have these topological and potentially even more difficult ones, these near or the less well-defined spatial relationships, and also the temporal relationships registered there. But that's currently a part of the debate in what would these relationships be? What's the list of the things that we need to send to IETF to register and publish?
Yeah, so you can have the standard Eigenhofer 9 types of topological relationship. But actually, we're often interested in things where the things themselves have no geometry associated with them, so you can't use conventional topological relationships between them. But that are equally important. So the use case that I said is, where's my bag? It's upstairs under the bed. What's the topological relationship there? But nevertheless, there is a spatial relationship that we're trying to express. Yeah, but that's another point for discussion. Any more on this one?
Thank you. Adam Iwaniak from Wrocław Institute. To tell you the truth, from time to time, for me, it's quite hard to follow English. Sorry for that, and probably also have problem to follow mine. But let me change the point of view about which vocabulary. I think that is strongly related to the previous point about URI index and also indexable, because I'm a cartographer, so I try to describe my point of view. Topographic maps are for general use, so you don't know precisely the user, but you have a lot of thematic maps which answer for the specific question. And my question is, what for you publish data on the web? What is the purpose? One object could be described in many different ways, yes, depend on the purpose you publish. If it's general one, you decided which ontology is the best. But sometimes you have a clear idea, yes? So in that case, you use a different ontology. And that case, is your object, special thing, have a different URI, yes? And there is no idea to publish all of these objects. I call that we only choose special object of interest. We have a point of interest, but it's a point. But here we have also line and area. So I call it that we should only publish special object of interest on the web.
actually quite a good description of this idea of the domain. So you carry on publishing the data for the domain that you represent. You know, I'm a cartography company, I'm publishing this data set. I'm a utility company, I publish this data. You do it for your domain using the ontology that's appropriate to your domain, but as long as we can formalize that and describe those ontologies, then in other domains, the data should be reusable. But I think it's good to come back to that core. And that although we may recommend you do things slightly differently, you are still publishing data because it's important for your community to publish the data in a particular way.
So let me continue. Yesterday I have a presentation, and I suggest that we can publish spatial data with HTML and RDFA. And the question is, what for we publish such? If we really need to publish information parallel to spatial data infrastructure, or we would like to deliver the answer for the question. I think that is the crucial point. If you would like to deliver the answer for the web user, it's absolutely different if you would like to share information.
Okay, thank you. So those were the 4 specific best practice questions we were asked to focus in on, to get some feedback from. We've now got, I suppose, 15 minutes or so for more general comments. I know it's probably difficult because you haven't read the document and worked your way through it, but we would certainly appreciate comments on the rest of the document. Are there any areas we should focus on, Clemens? We could go back to the coordinate referencing system question if we want a good argument. Let me put the document up. So this is actually what it looks like. I think this is one hand, much harder than it appears. Here we go. Priorities. Yeah, what I will do is hide that again. I'll put up the whole list of best practices. It's probably more useful to look through. Let me find those. Where are we? There we go. So that's the current list of best practices as they are. So Robin's point about priorities might be a good one. So they are, include spatial metadata in dataset metadata, provide context required to interpret data values, specify coordinate reference systems for high precision applications, make your data indexable, that was one of the ones we looked at specifically, describe the positional accuracy of spatial data, how might you do that, how to describe properties that change over time, that's again something we discussed around the edges of. Another one that we focused on was the unique HTTP identifiers for spatial things. Number 8, geometries on the web in a usable way was the encoding question. Number 9, how do you describe relative positions? So this was the one about how do you describe topology and other types of spatial relationship. Best practice 10, use spatial semantics. That's the one we were just looking at. 11, expose spatial data through convenience APIs, i.e. how do you make larger data sets accessible to people in a simple way. Include search capabilities in your Access API. Provide subsets for large spatial data sets. Publish links to related resources. Use links to find related data. Provide a minimum set of information for your intended application. And how do you work with crowdsourced observation? So those are the areas that we're looking at, providing some best practice, some pointers towards. So Andrea and then Robin has pointed out it will be useful if we could maybe get your feedback on which of those areas is perhaps more useful, or we have existing best practice that we'd like to highlight as something that would be a solution for one of those particular topics. So what do we think? Any overview questions? So those are all of the best practices that we're currently working on. Anything that's not on the list you think we should talk about? Or any of those unclear, maybe you could talk a bit more about?
Thanks. Just one maybe really basic question from outside. I'm coming here from public sector, mainly currently responsible for the Inspire implementation. But what maybe it's there. I flew through the titles, but I haven't seen it. I think it would be very useful to provide the colleagues like me who are trying to get in touch mainly with the e-government people, and really, at least in Slovakia, there is very strong, I would say, pressure to drive the e-government towards the linked data. And for us, it's now the big question how to make sure that whatever we will deliver from the Inspire will have a very easy chance to be reused in government, ideally using this approach, because we see that there is still some sort of, I'm not saying resistance, of course they will use whatever what will come through the, let's say, Inspire standards and or channels. But it would be very useful for non-technical readers to provide some simple guidance where to start and where to end. Maybe you're aware there was a project called ComSolt, which finished, I think, last year. They were focused more on open data, but they had two results. One was really methodology for public sector, how to cope with the open data, where to start, where to end, and there was some part also related to the linked data. And maybe this would be also good for that target audience to somehow condense all these things and really in easy, like there was these 10 points to be kept if you want to ensure that your data are properly published as a linked data, somehow to incorporate either to this document or to any outcome of your working group. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Those are very good points. So if I can paraphrase that, come up with some simple steps like the 5 stars that we could use to focus people's thoughts, and also look at what we do in spatial data and Inspire, in particularly within the context of broader open government. How do we make sure that what we're doing fits in with that broader mindset? I'll come around this way. I feel like I should be working on a TV talk show.
I think Martin's question is one of the main questions that are going around. A lot of member states doing Inspire and doing Ego at the same time. We've gotten the impression they're doing parallel implementations next to each other. Now, the problem doesn't have to be more difficult than it is. I would just propose to include the best practice to say, well, publish as much encodings as you can. I saw the demonstration of Klimus yesterday of the proxy LD that he developed, providing an adapter on existing architectures that actually allows you to provide web-enabled data link encodings based on your existing back office. You don't have to change your back office, and you don't have to change your data management system. Well, it's a matter of how do you disseminate your data, which encodings are you using, and you can actually provide GML and GeoJSON and so on, all different encodings at the same time. But you need to have the adapters and a best practice, including best practice saying, well, different encodings might serve different purposes, including EGOF, maybe within 5 years, not using GML anymore, and GeoJSON, use some kind of very intelligent what's called, or very mathematical described encoding in text, for example, which is super optimized. I mean, you won't talk about GeoJSON anymore, so it will evolve very quickly. So as much encodings as possible. Let's serve the purpose.
I think it's one comment to that is what is not shown here, and probably we should always show that. We had these kind of recommend or best practices included, but we've thrown them all out because they're in the best data on the web best practice, and we don't want to. We started included, but we cleaned basically, or the editors cleaned the documents, referencing where applicable the data on the web best practice, but not repeating them or rewording them. And I think it's so there is another set of similar number of best practices that apply to all data, and that's one of them.
But maybe a point from this audience then is it realistic to ask you to go and look at 2 documents, or should we somehow make sure they will be referenceable from here? But yeah, that's a good point.
Well, this is Roberto Lucchi from Essay. Well, the last remark from Clemens, I think, answered a little bit my comment. When I was reading this recommendation, I think except 3 and 10, I could remove spatial and think that that's a general recommendation. So my question is, what other communities have been successful in doing better, and how?
That's a very good point. So how special is spatial here? How much of this is different? As Clemens says, there is the Data on the Web working group that have just about completed their work. So there's another document that you can read alongside this that goes through the best practices for publishing data, not necessarily spatial data. So what we're aiming to do are to identify those areas where there is a difference, or where you perceive there to be a difference. And yes, it's arguable actually how much spatial is very different, and often the case it isn't hugely different. But we do recognize things like coordinate reference systems are things that we do have to pull out as being particular for our regime.
Well, I think I've got 2 suggestions for new best practices. One is really in line with the previous comments, a best practice on how you can reuse your existing systems that you have for Inspire with all the related OGC standards. How can we make quick steps to go into this spatial data on the web topic? But that's quite logical, I think. But the other one is, what I'm really missing is, one of the reasons why we are quite heavily investing in this stuff is that we want to be able to query on the web through different data sets. And that part of querying the data, I think is quite missing. And especially in our implementations now, it's really blocking, because yeah, well, we've got Sparkle, we've got GeoSparkle, but the GeoSparkle implementation on triple source is really awful. So in the end, we had to get it out. Well, we're having a lot of this right now, but still we are not able to make those federated queries and that kind of stuff. So a best practice on how we should deal with that, how we should deal with a reliable, robust Sparkle endpoint, GeoSparkle, would be really appreciated.
So did you get those, Clemens? Potentially two extra candidates?
I try my best.
Any more? No? Oh, sorry, Robin.
I think I'm starting to wake up. The other thing that occurred to me is most of the, you said publishing, I thought most of this is directed like the 2 people in this room, more or less. But I think point 15, and that's before the screensaver came on, point 15 was about you could also apply to people using the data, so the yellow flowers. And I don't know if we're yet in a position to have that conversation, but I think it's also quite important to look at that aspect, because there could be recommendations about how to use geospatial data on the web, because a lot of things are about picking up somebody's data, adding your bit and passing it on. So provide a set of information for your intended application. Wasn't that one? No, it's number 14. Provide links to related resources and use links to find related data. That starts that conversation, but because of our kind of world is about providing access to data, of course that's all nice and correct, but then the next step in the workflow might be quite interesting to engage with those red and yellow flowers.
No, I think that's a really good point, and I think it's something that we as a community often forget, because we are mostly data publishers, or that's what we're thinking about. You know, it should go without saying that we are doing this with an understanding of what our users want and how they're going to make use of the data that we're publishing. But actually, you know, hand on heart, how real is that sometimes? So I think, you know, all of these best practices are, certainly from the publisher's point of view, it is about publishing spatial data. But we have to do that with a very good understanding of what our users want or need, and recognize the fact that often, increasingly in the world that we operate in, we don't know directly those users. They may have no relationship with us. They may come across our data trying to build an application that they need to solve a particular task and may never have a relationship with us. We may never fully understand what they're trying to do. But we still need to be able to publish data to meet their needs. And that's challenging. You know, we're not publishing data just for other data publishers. You know, we're publishing data for a much broader community and an increasingly diverse community. And you know, many of these best practices are trying to put us into the position where we can do that most efficiently. But it's a really good point in that, you know, we are doing this for a bunch of people who aren't in the room always.
I think Robin's point is really good, because a data user could very easily become a data publisher to someone else. And I think we have to be careful in what we're putting here, that these data users who aren't necessarily in our domain can actually work out what to do next.
Okay, I think time's pretty much up. Any last questions? Any last comments? It would really help us if you do go and have a look on the web, have a look at the document, and look at the mailing list from the wiki. Perhaps the wiki is the best place to start in all things. I'll put the URL back up. And keep in touch. We do feel a little bit isolated doing often quite a lot of this work. So we'd appreciate any feedback from the broader community involved in the process. Let me put the URL back up. There. So check out that wiki page. It's got all the links to the meetings and the activities that are currently taking place. Your feedback would be really, really appreciated. Drop us a line to the mailing list. It's an open mailing list. Anyone can send a message. And the editors in particular are very good at getting back to you on any comments. Actually, you know, we have to do that. We have to prove that we are responding to every comment to go through the standardization process. So any comment that you make, it will be responded. So please do so. Other than that, thank you very much for your time. I think we've all earned our coffee. Great, thank you very much. Clemens, anything else from you? Good, excellent, thank you very much.